The trade deadline is closing in as the St. Louis Cardinals need to pick a direction. The new quotes from Ryan Helsley show that the Cardinals closer may have a better idea of the way the Cardinals need to approach things than the Cardinals even do themselves. We'll talk about that coming up on B-Schaeff Daily. What's going on, everyone, and welcome in to this edition of B-Schaeff Daily. Brenden Schaeffer with you. It's Tuesday, July 29th, 2025. We're 2 days away from the MLB trade deadline as the Cardinals are expected to be at least soft sellers at this deadline, knowing they've got a few players on short-term contracts that other MLB teams, would-be contenders, might find interesting. The Cardinals did win on Monday night, 7-1, defeating the Miami Marlins. But the way that they finished off the San Diego series over the weekend suggests that the Cardinals should be full steam ahead when it comes to selling on those short-term assets. The names we're talking about, guys like Phil Maton, and of course at the top of the list, Ryan Helsley, the closer who throws triple digits and is heading into a contract off-season where he'll be a free agent and he'll be eligible to look at the other 29 teams and say, hey, what do you got for me? He wants to be a Cardinal. He has reiterated over and over again that he would love to remain with the St. Louis Cardinals. But now with the shadow of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of MLB free agency in the prime of your career, now we see the shadow of that sort of looming over the Cardinals and over Ryan Helsley. We know what probably has to happen here. He's got to be moved. Now, I do think it's interesting in an article written by Derrick Goold of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch earlier today, Ryan Helsley told Derrick that, being traded wouldn't necessarily preclude me from having interest in coming back and signing with the Cardinals in the offseason. I believe the phrase that Derrick used was that it would be a detour, but not a detriment necessarily to Helsley potentially coming back to the Cardinals via free agency. I don't believe that's something that's realistic. I believe Ryan Helsley when he says it would be the case. He wouldn't hold it against the Cardinals if they had to trade him. But I think the reasoning behind why he wouldn't necessarily hold it against him is that he seems to understand, perhaps as well as or better than the way the Cardinals understand it, where they're at right now as a club. And Helsley basically saying, look, I wouldn't be surprised if I were traded because when you look at the state of things, Cardinals probably need to trade me. Now, that's not a direct quote from Ryan Helsley, but I will share for you what he told Derrick Goold, which is a great article to read over at STL today. One aspect of the quotes, he said, I wouldn't want to be a sourpuss about it. Obviously, I want to stay here my whole career, but I think they have the perfect opportunity that they want to do now in the season, which is shed some payroll and get some guys out of here and see what the young guys can do in this last 60 or so game stretch. So that's certainly talking like Ryan Helsley would be understanding a potential trade and perhaps that he's even expecting one. But the best part of the quotes that I thought Helsley told to Derrick Goold was that when asked about, the direction of the organization and whether it's heading now in a positive direction, Helsley said to Derrick, quote, I really do. It's not a secret that we've got to get starting pitching. At some point, they're going to have to spend money if they're going to compete. And Helsley notes, our minor league system has been crushed by injuries. Obviously, that makes even more sense to trade us now to get some prospects. So, for as much as Ryan Helsley is on this team, would love nothing more than to see this thing ridden out to the end and the Cardinals make the playoffs and maybe make a push to a World Series. Realistically, the closer on the team goes, they might need to get some prospects for us. Now's the time. He may have an understanding of where the Cardinals are at better than the Cardinals do. And now I do believe Helsley will be traded. It could come while I'm recording this podcast. Wouldn't shock me. If it does, I hope it's quick because I'd rather them do it before I stop recording than after I posted it. But nevertheless, he seems to see what's coming. Phil Maton probably understands what could be and should be coming with him. Look, man, Maton was signed in the spring. It was not a long-term Cardinal. But when they got him, you thought he can help you and be a good force in the middle of the back end of your bullpen. And if things go well, he'll be probably one of the reasons that they were able to get over the hump. If things don't go quite well enough to put yourself as a team in that position, well, then Phil Maton can become a trade chip on a good season that maybe nets you a prospect. I think always back to a few years ago, Aroldis Chapman was signed by the Royals in the offseason. And I was like, man, that's an interesting signing for a Royals team that's, probably not going anywhere just yet. And they weren't. But they knew the moment they signed him that he was potentially going to turn into a prospect for that Royals team. And sure enough, he did. Cole Ragans ended up being the guy that was dealt when the Royals parted with Aroldis Chapman. They picked up Cole Ragans, who turned into an all-star caliber starter for them. Now, granted, he has not been healthy this season, but still hopefully has a bright future in Kansas City if he can get consistent health. It just goes to show that with the right identification process, from identifying a reliever that you can sign in the offseason to then identifying that, hey, this still may not be our year, but it's not a reason not to spend a little bit of money. It's almost like buying a prospect. If you can then identify and work with the team that is pitcher needy at the trade deadline to come up with a landing spot for that player, like a Phil Maton in this instance, and for the Cardinals, potentially a really good prospect to come from that organization. I'm not saying you're going to get somebody's top prospect or even somebody in their top 5 and maybe even not their top 10. I think for some orgs, you could certainly pull a top 10 organizational piece for a Ryan Helsley and maybe even a Phil Maton. We'll see. But that's just the point of it all, right? They've got to be able to negotiate and maybe pit some offers against one another and do the tactics, do the deal, find a way to get something done and better the organization for it. It's obviously disappointing when you look back at the 2023 trade deadline, and the Cardinals kind of had a very clear direction by the end of it. It took them a while to commit to it, even though they were well below 500 that season at the end of July. But they traded off those short-term assets, guys like Jack Flaherty, guys like Jordan Hicks, guys like Jordan Montgomery, and they ended up with a haul of names. Now, whether or not those names have turned into anything for the Cardinals to this point is perhaps the disappointment. Tekoa Roby, we find out earlier this week, had Tommy John surgery. I believe it was on Friday. So he's out for the year and also likely out for 2026. It's just the latest blow to a Cardinal minor league pitching staff that has really gone through it this year, with names like Cooper Jerpy, Tink Hence experiencing prolonged injury. In Jerpy's case, he's out for the year. Sam Robertson had Tommy John as well. Tink, we don't quite know the extent, but it's just been on again, off again with him on the injured list. And I'm still keeping an eye on Quinn Matthews because of the recent note in his decline of the velocity and the command issues that he's been experiencing. So that's sort of a state of the union when it comes to the Cardinals minor league pitching depth. But back to that 2023 deadline, there's just not a lot to show for the fact that the Cardinals sold out that July. And they did the right thing in selling out. But we said, hey, you got a bunch of pieces that are expiring on their contracts at the end of the season. You got to be realistic with what you might be able to get back. And maybe Roby still has a bright future. A lot of guys come back from TJ, and they're even better for it. It's more of a not an if but a when type of conversation, and maybe getting this one out of the way for Tekoa Roby, even though they did try ever since he got here to avoid it. It just seemed like he had battled injuries before coming to the Cardinals. You try like hell to avoid knocking out a year and a half of a guy's career basically with the Tommy John surgery, but ultimately they were unable to keep the kid healthy, and that's unfortunate because he was a rising star in the organization in terms of the pitching depth. But they'll look to him for 2027 as he'll begin the long and arduous process of rehabbing back. There's other guys, though, too. It's just reality that you probably have to be realistic about how quickly those minor league pitchers are going to be able to help in St. Louis. Other than Roby from that deadline, you still do have John King that was brought in one of those trades. And Tyler Sejacy right now is on the Major League roster. He had a nice game last night, getting on base a few times. So there are still pieces from that time period that the Cardinals could see some payoff from, but it was an underwhelming return overall when you think back to that 2023 deadline and having a couple of years of distance from it. Now what happens at this one? Do the Cardinals do something similar where you say, yeah, they might be able to squeak out 83 wins again if they're able to just kind of keep the band together and hold on for dear life, win some of these games that are close and late by throwing Phil Maton, Ryan Helsley in those games down the stretch? Or do you say we're going to have to do something similar to 2023, even though we're not nearly as bad as we were in 2023, because the Cardinals are still above 500 rather than the 13 games under that they were at the end of July that year? I think you have to do it. You have to sell on these pieces and hope that guys like Matt Swanson, who came in yesterday and did give up a run in the Cardinals' 7-1 win over the Marlins. Great pitching, by the way, from Andre Palante last night. Those are the kind of outings you really appreciate from him. If they are more frequent rather than few and far between, then all the more potential for him in your rotation, not only the rest of this year, but for 2026 and beyond. But you look at Matt Swanson throwing 100 miles per hour coming out of the bullpen last night. You talk about a STP when we talk Mizzou football. Something to prove for Matt Swanson, who has kind of been an afterthought, despite being a guy that has come up a number of times and performed in the roles that they've asked of him. They just have not given him one look really in leverage. And so last night, not leverage, but maybe an introduction to that by giving him the ninth inning in a kind of a blowout game. It was 7-0 at the time, was maybe a step in that direction. And certainly seeing the triple-digit stuff on the radar gun does not hurt when it comes to interpreting what his value could be. So that's how you look at it. In my opinion, you got guys like Swanson, Graceffo. You could dip down below and bring back guys like Roycroft or Ryan Fernandez. I'm not saying anyone's going to be celebrating that because they didn't perform while they were with the Cardinals. But it's Granillo. It's a number of those types of guys that are going to get a look, and you find out more about the players that you have on your team. Helsley, gone. Maton, gone. Steven Matz, perhaps, on an expiring deal, is going to garner some interest. Miles Michaelis probably wouldn't garner a ton of interest, but he is on a no trade as well, so it would be requiring his approval even if the Cardinals were to find a landing spot for him. I know the Braves ended up taking on Eric Fetty. Maybe Miles Michaelis would clear a no-trade clause to a place like that, although Atlanta not really in the mix. I think, by the way, the reason the Braves take him is because they've had so many injuries to their starting pitching, and it's really tanked their season despite the talent that exists within that position player group. But the Fetty part is interesting because, hey, you could say at the end of it all, well, Brenden, you spent the whole month talking about how the Cardinals bungled this, trying to preserve some trade value for Fetty, and in the end, they were able to trade him, so I guess the joke's on you. No, that's not how I feel. They bungled it for sure, and it is, as I said all along, the best they could have hoped to receive in an Eric Fetty trade was a little bit of salary relief, and I believe that's what they probably got, as it was announced by the team that he was traded, Fetty was, to the Braves over the weekend, for cash considerations or a player to be named later. This is not me reporting this, but I think back to like the Dexter Fowler trade a number of years ago when he went in the offseason from the Cardinals to the Angels and unfortunately quickly tore his ACL that following season. But Fowler was owed a decent salary by the Cardinals, and when it was announced that they had traded him, it was that same verbiage of a player to be named later or cash considerations. And really what that ended up being, I think, is that the Cardinals didn't have to pay the entire salary for Dex for that season. They might have gotten out from under a little bit of that money and really didn't get anything in return other than a little bit of relief from the contract itself. It was like, it's not money that you're actually necessarily being sent as much as it is, which I guess it could still be the case. They could send it to him. However, functionally it works out. It's more that, hey, if we owed you $10 million, well, we're the Angels. We'll take Dexter Fowler off your hands and we'll pay him $1 million. So really then the Cardinals only had to pay $9 of the $10 million remaining. Not as exciting as it sounds when you're getting cash considerations, but I think that's kind of how the Fetty thing plays out. Unless I missed it and Fowler ended up getting traded and a player to be named was eventually named. I don't recall that happening. I don't expect one to be named for Fetty either. He was owed 2.5 or 2.7, whatever it was, $1 million remaining on this season. He will get the bulk of that, I would guess, from the Cardinals. The Braves will pay a little bit, and that was the cash considerations. That is my guess as to how the Fetty thing came to be. So, no, it's as I said all along, the best you could hope for is to save a little bit of money, and I hope it was worth it, because what it did is it turned the Cardinals into sellers. Now, there are a lot of people who would say the Cardinals should have been sellers anyway. They weren't going to win the World Series this year, yada, yada, yada. We have been down that road. So now let's just skip to the part where we talk about them as sellers and, wonder about how many of these short-term assets might be moved. Helsley feels like a no-brainer. Maton, to me, another one. Beyond that, it's a little bit tricky, because although Steven Matz is on an expiring deal, he is one of those guys that if push comes to shove and you experience some injuries down the stretch to your rotation, Matz could slide in, and if nothing else, he can give you some bulk innings if you have to go for a bullpen day. You can stretch him back out. Kyle Leahy's another guy that you could probably continue to stretch out if push comes to shove. But I do think there is value in that, because there's value in the Cardinals not totally tanking August and September in the way that they did back in 2023, where you had Jacob Lawrence, I'm combining names now, Casey Lawrence, Jacob Barnes, Andrew Suarez. You had those types of guys that just came off the street, essentially. Suarez was in the minor league system for the full year, but those other guys just kind of were signed late. Kind of reminds you of the Cardinals bringing in Aaron Wilkerson, the 36-year-old who had 8 shutout innings last week in a start at Memphis. Could be some depth for the big league club, but, he was not performing in his recent years in the big leagues. And so if you bring him up, you're kind of just having a veteran journeyman guy eat some innings without an expectation of performance. And that's not what you want if you're developing winning players. You want Mason Wynn. You want Victor Scott II. You want these guys to be Ivan Herrera. You want these guys to be in situations where their production matters, their performance matters, rather than just saying, oh, we're thinking we can lose every game and that's not going to do anything to the psyche of some developing players. No, you want it to be meaningful. And it's hard to do that when you're bringing in guys off the street to pitch for you that weren't, considered worthy of AAA at the last place that they went. It's not to knock any of those guys. It just would be the concern with wholesale changes to your bullpen. But certain guys that have value, you got to move them. I'd even go a step beyond the expiring assets and still look at a guy like JoJo Romero. I don't know if the Cardinals have the stomach for it, but I think JoJo probably has a ton of value, and I really like him. Maybe he's a guy that you say, nope, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to actually sign him to a small extension to lock him up for reasonable terms for a number of years. And maybe that's something to which he would be amenable, to get that guaranteed money for relievers who oftentimes, until you get to free agency, nothing is guaranteed about the state of your career and the progress that it could see, when relievers is just a very fickle position by nature. So it's interesting to think about the way that could develop. But also there could be teams that are contending right now that would see the benefit of a late inning left-hander that has been performing with lockdown efficiency in recent weeks and months. Cardinals could get something for JoJo because he's got another year attached of team control on what should be an affordable amount through the ARB process. So that is another aspect of this that I would certainly consider. I'm not calling teams about JoJo Romero from the Cardinals. Again, I really like to have him around, and I want to see the Cardinals not just totally throw in the towel for next year before the season even begins. They'll need to sign JoJo Romero-type guys in free agency, I think, to staff a bullpen and potentially a rotation and a bench next year, guys in that salary range. So why not have a guy that is already around and proven for you if you can manage it? But if you're getting your door beaten down about JoJo Romero and you're the Cardinals front office, could be some legitimacy to the idea that you sell on the asset while it is at its all-time high. Like a stock, you'd love to be able to time the market. I think the Cardinals have done a poor job of even attempting to time the market when it comes to these types of assets under John Mozeliak in years past. But John Mozeliak on the way out the door, what do you have to lose other than potentially one more trade? I feel like it's one of those deals where if there's some real legitimate pieces being offered for just about anybody on this roster, but JoJo is a good example. No, I don't agree with the idea that Cardinals fans would put out there and say, you're not going to be good for 3 or 4 years anyway. That's not something the Cardinals have publicly or privately conceded. So I'm not necessarily viewing it that way. I think a lot of the timeline conversation to the Cardinals becoming competitive and truly competitive for playoffs, divisions, and world championships again is going to depend in part on what the commitment from ownership is going to be and how quickly they are going to be willing to spend. Because you can make a case that even in offseason where they do a good bit of spending, certainly more than they did this past time through, only signing Maton, that type of offseason could happen where you sign multiple free agents, not the high-dollar guys at the top of the class, but some lower and mid-level free agents similar to Maton and maybe even a little bit beyond what he signed for. And you do all of that and still have a lower payroll in 2026 than you did in 2025. Maybe you're able to trade Nolan Arenado this week. Maybe you're able to make some other moves in the offseason that would clear you some salary obligations. Those are things that I think are worthwhile for the Cardinals to consider, but that doesn't mean you just turn around and concede that you're not going to be any good next year. No, you move Arenado. If you can do it this week, you clear up a spot at third base for when Nolan Gorman comes back and he can just play. Or maybe if Gorman can't stay healthy, you get to mid-August and decide J.J. Weatherholt's still ripping it, and now we can maintain his rookie eligibility. Let's call him up to give him a cup of coffee at the end of the season, a la Mason Wynn at the end of 2023, so that he's even more familiarized and prepared for what he's going to face when he looks to make the club out of spring training next year. Like, there are reasons to do some of these things that also give you the benefit of potentially clearing some salary off the board. And when you do that, I think you should spend to about what you had this year as far as a payroll. And maybe, honestly, the things that should be happening are get some money on the books for guys like Brendan Donovan with a contract extension talk that should happen in earnest this winter. So a lot of ways that things could go. We're not entirely sure the degree to which the Cardinals will be selling, but I just thought it was interesting that a guy like Ryan Helsley, even in his position where he is potentially the center point of all of this for the Cardinals, the focal point of what could happen during the next couple of days, even he goes, at some point we're going to have to spend some money in this organization if we're going to win. And starting pitching is going to have to be an area where that happens when you look especially at the way the minor leagues have been not only tested but depleted through the number of injuries that they have had in the AAA rotation in 2025. That's going to do it, though, for this edition of the show. Wanted to get some quick thoughts out. To apologize for missing part of the weekend on B-Schaeff Daily. Was in the Chicago area for a bowling tournament, but wanted to kind of jump in here. And moving forward, you can just probably expect anytime there's legitimate news here within the next couple of days, I will try to have a primer either that afternoon, that night, whenever I'm able to fit it in throughout my busy day. I know we'll be going live with SEL Sports Central if anything crazy happens, so that'll probably becoming a little bit before any reaction on B-Schaeff Daily. But stay tuned to this feed and to the podcast feeds and the YouTube feeds for STL Sports Central and the Brenden Schaeffer channel. Thank you guys so much, though, for listening. Let me know your thoughts below in the comments section, and we will talk to you next time on B-Schaeff Daily. Peace.